Good evening to those of you who live east of here, and good afternoon to those of you who live west of here. This is our first event at Washington, D.C. This was the idea of our managing editor, Abul Hasanat Siddiq. And we have a great panelist here. First of all, before I mention anyone, I must thank Raj Sharma, who has been our host, who has ensured that you have dinner after this event. You'll have to walk to the kitchen, which is not too far, even by American standards. And Raj is the co-founder and CEO of Sensio. He's not here because of health reasons, but he has worked on improving public and social outcomes through management. He's also the chairman of Public Spend Forum, and you can look up his extensive bio online, but he's a jolly good chap. Moderating the panel today will be John Blake, and John's a legend. In fact, he's older than many Washington, D.C. institutions. Once upon a time, he was the big boss of a firm called Covington. Is it Covington in Burling, or
Yes,
is it Covington
yes.
in Burling? Okay, Covington in Burling. And he has, amongst other things, run a lot. He has played tennis. He has gone to that university where George Bush Sr. and Jr. went to, named Yale. But he did better than them. He won a Rhodes Scholarship and went to Oxford as well. But that is the past. In the recent past, he has been involved in major litigations. He has worked very actively in public service, and in particular, telecommunications and globalizing telecommunications has been his field. Next to me is Deborah Stein. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yes, that's fine.
Excellent. And she has more than 30 years of experience in policy analysis and advocacy on behalf of vulnerable children and their families. She is a former lawyer, a recovering lawyer, I suppose, and she has extensive experience in strategic communications as well. So I'll move on now to Ian McCredie. Ian McCredie is a former senior British Foreign Service official. You should know it just from his suit and tie. You know, no one dresses as well as the British, except the Italians and the French. And Ian now focuses on companies, on helping companies navigate the complexities in managing the risk of frontier markets. He was the head of corporate security at Shell International. So those of you who don't like big oil can blame him this evening. To Ian's right is John Feffer. John Feffer is the director of Foreign Policy in Focus, Institute for Policy Studies, and John has written a dystopian novel, Splinterlands, which I have read and enjoyed enormously. It is a rather dark view of the universe. He very much believes in William Butler Yeats, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Perhaps there will be an Arminius revolting against an Augustus, and the end of Magna Germania will result in the end of the Roman Empire, which is the metaphor for the end of the modern empire, which is the US. But John's a brilliant analyst. He's a fantastic writer, and he is a fine mind. So we have a very, very eminent set of people. I am also on the panel. I am the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, and we are a Section 501c3 nonprofit. And so whatever I say is in my individual capacity. It is not representing Fair Observer. My views are my views alone, not the organization's views. We run a journal, which you can see behind me. We have a focus on the deeper issues behind the news. We provide context, historical, philosophical, economic, and so on and so forth. And we bring together voices and narratives from across borders, backgrounds, and beliefs. Today we have 1,800 plus writers from over 70 countries. All of you here have been great supporters. We have a global community. We have come a long way, and our focus is to democratize and globalize discourse through the journal, as well as now through our education arm, which is to go out and train a number of young voices to share their perspectives, to join in the conversation about the future of the planet itself. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to John Blake, our exceedingly eminent moderator. And there we go. We are off to the races.
Well, I have a feeling that at the end of this, the introduction that Atul made of his fair observer is going to be part of the answer.
Thank you.
And deservedly so. I thought before we get started, I thought I'd just run down basically what our agenda is. We're going to start by asking each of the panelists to identify their perspective, the lens that they view these issues through, to orient each of us and to orient you as the audience in preparation for questions that you may want to ask in the course of the afternoon. We're going to start with, after they identify those perspectives, we're going to have a series of quickies, one-word answers, bing, 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 sort of unfair, intentionally, hopefully fun, and maybe give you some ideas of the questions you may want to ask them as we go on through the course of the afternoon. Then there are going to be some substantive questions that I will direct at specific panelists. We hope to have a conversation among each other and invite you to join in at that point. We're going to then turn to two of the themes that Atul has identified, namely apathy and ignorance, both of which fair observer attack, right?
Sure.
And then we'll discuss Atul's last questions, what to do about it. And throughout this, we'll urge that you join in, but for this first part, or the second part really, when first we have the identifying of perspectives and then these quickie questions, we'll get through that, and then it's open sesame, really. And there is a huge diversity of expertise, experience, and interests that I think you'll find very interesting, and that's why they're going to introduce themselves with respect to the perspectives that they bring to bear. So Deb, go ahead.
So my perspective is decidedly domestic. I focus on U.S. policy, and I do so at the federal, state, and local level. I've spent 30 years working with advocates, so I think I have a pretty good sense of how our legislative and administrative processes are working and what shapes them, what influences them, who engages in them, and how to change them. I will say that my perspective is decidedly progressive and nonpartisan, which may not be a combination you've heard of a lot, but actually works in great detail. And I would say it's also optimistic, which may come in part from the fact that in 2003 and 4 and 5, we had 3 years of a Congress and a president that were all from the same party, which was Republican, attacking healthcare very much the way they are today. And for 3 years, we fought off those attacks successfully because we didn't see the world as monolithic, and we were able to work with people on both sides of the aisle to protect things that everybody cared about. And so that is very much my perspective. The other thing that you should know about me is that in addition to my professional work on advocacy, I now consider myself to be one tiny cog in the resistance, very much on the policy side. Oops, we've lost our mic there.
There you go.
Can we just leave it on the table? Or, okay. And so I've also seen a lot of how the resistance is or is not working And that obviously will hopefully shed some light on the apathy. Like Atul, my views are solely my own, and I do not speak for my organization, but of course they are gleaned from years of experience with a number of organizations that do this work. So.
Atul?
So my perspective is largely informed by an examination of the human condition and my fundamental belief that we are, whether we like it or not, social beings, but at the same time we retain a desire for individualism and freedom. And my perspective is shaped by this constant balancing act we have to maintain as individuals as well as societies. And what I mean very simply by that balancing act is that the desire for prosperity is fundamental in some ways to all societies. Most people who are parents want their children to lead better lives. That's what my mother wanted for me. Now, I've broken rule 1 already, which was not to mention my mother. But
We had a pact.
yeah, but there you go. But the point is that that desire to lead materially better lives often comes at a huge personal cost, can come at a loss of social cohesion, and can be ruinous for the environment. There are many civilizations that splintered away because perhaps they overexpanded, or perhaps they exploited resources too much, or perhaps the differences between the elites and les sans-culottes became a little too wide and a little too deep. So my perspective is very much informed by how do we keep that balance, not just individually but socially, and not just socially but between different cultures and different competing demands on the planet, where the destinies of over 7 billion people are now inextricably intertwined.
Ian?
Well, thank you, Atul. Yes, I regret I'm probably going to be the pessimist on this panel, because whilst I think there's lots of reasons for optimism, there are more reasons for pessimism. I had a long career in the British Foreign Service, and I was in Iran during the Iranian Revolution. I was in Denmark at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and had a front row seat there. And I was at the British Embassy in Washington during 2001 and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. So I had front row seats to see what was happening there too. So I feel I've got a pretty close idea of how policy is made, and I see a lot of policy being made at the moment which I see as a threat to our freedoms and democracy as we go forward, and that the future is not going to be the same as the past by any means. I think in particular, and I'll speak about this more later on, that democracy is under great threat because democracy has not delivered the things that we all want it to deliver: economic security, healthcare, education for all, growing prosperity, and above all, it has failed to curb political corruption. And I'm not just talking about America, I'm just talking globally. Democracy has not lived up to its promise. And I regret to say that many countries are turning away from it to other solutions for that reason. And I think the combination of that failure with also the failure to address the enormous challenge of climate change and the massive overpopulation of the world is going to cause us some grave problems in the future. So on that note, I'll hand over to John.
Thank you. So like Deb, I'm progressive, nonpartisan. I work for the Institute for Policy Studies, which is a progressive think tank here in Washington. My specialties are North Korea, which might of course be of interest to you, at this moment. I've traveled there 3 times. I lived in Japan focusing and did my work focusing on the Korean Peninsula. My other area of expertise is Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. I lived and worked in that region as well. In terms of whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist, well, obviously in my fiction, as Atul pointed out, I'm very pessimistic, but that's fiction. And so I like to divide my life into the time I spend on fiction and the time I spend on nonfiction. And I like to believe that I adhere to that great insight of Antonio Gramsci when he said that he had optimism of the spirit and pessimism of the mind. So perhaps we can manage to maintain both perspectives simultaneously when we look at the world.
Well, my perspectives can be summarized by 2 things that I've worked on. One is currently a nonprofit which we just formed about 2 weeks ago, which actually got starting to be organized 7 months ago, which is called Making Every Vote Count. And it has the modest ambition of reforming the American presidential process. And there's some very interesting things I've learned about that. First of all, our founders thought of American democracy as an experiment. Most of them thought it wouldn't last 100 years. Jefferson thought it might last 20. Adams, who was the optimist, thought it would last till about 1860. Addison was somewhere between. It was not a true democracy. The founders would have been appalled at the process that the Tories used with respect to Brexit, would never have done it. I wanted to write something saying you should have read the American founders before you got yourself into this problem. And they were very much aware, the founders were, of what we're going through now, or what we're threatened with, which is a democracy that is struggling, would be taken over by a dictator, by a sort of a charismatic, although that's not the way I feel about him, somebody who leads it astray, and it devolves, as did Greece and Rome, into dictatorship, tyranny. The major flaw in our presidential election process is that it's not democratic. It is the only election held, basically, in the United States where majority doesn't rule, where every vote counts. If you elect a governor, if you elect a mayor, you board of elections, whatever, it's all in terms of majority vote. And the votes don't weigh equally. In fact, the elections are being determined by the population, by the voting population in 6 swing states. So when you get down to it, the actual votes that count are the majority party in those 6 states. The other thing that influences my viewpoint is that I've represented media companies for something like 52 years. We represented the Washington Post during Watergate, when the Nixon administration went after their television licenses to punish the press, which sort of has, I mean, it was really an extreme, maybe the worst example in the United States. We fought that for 3 years and all kinds of stuff, but I've been very impressed by the importance of the press, the power of the press, how it's always under fire, which is another reason why I'm so interested in what Fair Observer is trying to do. So with that, we'll move on to the quickies. One-word answers. Deb, we'll start with you, we'll go down, and then we'll come back the other way. 20 years from now, will democracy be stronger or weaker worldwide?
Stronger.
Weaker.
Weaker.
The deciding vote.
Which part of you is going to vote on this?
The optimism of my spirit says stronger.
Okay, then starting with you, John, will the rule of law be stronger or weaker?
Stronger.
Weaker.
Weaker.
It's going to be about the same.
Okay. A hedge. Okay, this is a question. I'll start with Deb because John's clearly going to be going to do cleanup on this one. Will the United States attack North Korea in the next 3 years? That's what I wrote down earlier in the week. Today, the question is in the next 3 weeks, but answered in terms of three years.
Yes.
Atul?
No.
Ian?
Depends what you mean by attack. A full-scale invasion as in Iraq, no. But they will do other things.
Okay.
Yeah, if we're talking Twitter, it's already. But military, I would say no.
Will North Korea attack South Korea in the next 3 years? John, you start this one off.
No.
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 5 years from now, will Britons regard Brexit to have been a success?
No.
Certainly not.
Yes, because it will satisfy those people who wanted Brexit in the first place. Will they be more prosperous and freer and happier and better off materially? No, they won't. But will they be happier? Yes, they will. They'll regard it as a success.
John?
Well, hard to disagree with a Briton, but I would say no.
Okay. I want to remind us all that there's one-word answers here.
I only broke the rule once.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, it's like a false start in the sprint. Or it used to be. They've changed that rule. Okay, John, in the same time frame, will the EU regard it as a success or a failure?
Failure.
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 True or false? In the 2014 U.S. House elections, the Republicans won more votes than the Democrats.
False.
Could you repeat?
In the 2014 U.S. House elections, the Republicans won more votes than the Democrats.
Pass.
Pass?
Well, I'll say false.
False.
All the falses were right. The reason I put that in, by the way, was because the Republicans got a huge victory due to gerrymandering and voter suppression, both very undemocratic.
The Democrats had more votes, the Republicans had many more seats.
Yes, better put. Thank you. All right, John, will Trump still be in office at the time of the 2018 election?
Yes.
Yes, certainly.
Yes.
No.
Optimist. Of the following, who will be the first official to leave the administration? Tillerson, Mathis, Sessions, Bannon, Tom Price, or DeVos?
Tillerson.
Sessions.
Tillerson.
Tillerson.
Wow.
He may have left. I'm not kidding. He's not around, and they just sort of say he's on leave, but nobody can reach him. He may be gone.
I didn't ask the question, who would you most like to leave first?
Oh.
Who will be the Democratic Party's presidential nominee in 2020?
You're
John?
going to give us some choices? Or?
No.
Pull this one out of my...
But you only get to say the last name because it's a one-word answer.
Yeah. Warren.
Oprah Winfrey.
Warren.
Harris.
By the way, Warren is Elizabeth Warren for those
Right.
abroad.
Yeah.
And Harris is Kamala Harris. And Warren just said she's not running.
Oh, okay.
Well, people have said that before.
I'm not saying it's definitive, it's just a point of
Yeah,
information.
it's almost qualifying. Okay, in 5 years, will Latin America be more democratic or less? Deb, you unfortunately go first, but that's the way, the luck of the draw.
More.
Less.
Less.
More.
In 5 years, will Assad still be in power? John?
I would say yes.
No.
No.
Yes.
Deb, in 5 years, will China be more democratic or less?
Less.
Less.
The same as it is now.
More.
More?
Yep.
Good. Okay, now we're going to turn to the panelist by panelist questions.
Could I
Yeah,
interject and
sure.
just if
Yeah, of
any
course
of
you-
you want to tweet, use the hashtag make sense and make M capital and S capital. I forgot about it. I'm not, as you can see, a typical tweeter.
Well, that's a relief. I've always thought you were a good guy.
Yes.
Okay, Deb. How has inequality, real or perceived, played into the threats against democracy?
I think perceived inequality played a bigger role than real in the last election, at least in this country. A lot of the people who voted not only for Trump, but for a number of the other people on the ballot perceived themselves to be doing so badly they couldn't do any worse. That would be true across races even. Part of the pitch was, can you do any worse? Well, I think, in fact, the people who were voting because they thought their lives couldn't be worse, if you look at them objectively, their average income was about $70,000, which is, certainly not the bottom of the income scale in the U.S. It was people who do, in fact, have things to lose, but that was not their perception. They perceived themselves to be absolutely at the bottom. And real inequality also played a very large role because it was the extremely wealthy who gave the campaign money that supported a lot of, not just the presidential candidates, but candidates across the board. People who are not just in the top 1%, but 1/100th of 1%. People with wealth that's kind of unimaginable to most of us. So I think it played in, but not in the ways that people necessarily thought it did.
Atul, about Asia, Southeast Asia, am I wrong in thinking that it is more stable than it was 10 years ago? And combined with that, is it more democratic than 10 years ago?
Whew.
I know that covers a lot of territory.
Yeah, it does. And so are Malaysia and Indonesia more democratic? And the answer would be probably yes, in balance. Although the growth of hardline Islam in Malaysia and Indonesia, partly due to Saudi money, isn't entirely reassuring. Is Philippines more democratic? Well, certainly not. You have Duterte in power, and you have Mindanao facing a war on drugs. I mean, whole of country, but Mindanao in particular, Islamists and the war on drugs. And if you go to Thailand, in Thailand you have de facto civil war between the yellow shirts and the red shirts. So is it more democratic? Well, In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. The devil lies in the details. Depends on the country and depends on the situation. Is the region more prosperous? Of course it is, compared to the past, but the region is now suffering because of the economic slowdown. Globally, the slowdown is affecting the vulnerable economies far worse. Indonesia is an extractive economy, and they are exceedingly vulnerable to commodity prices. So are they suffering? Yes. And my belief is whenever you have economic pain, whenever you have deep inequalities, and I don't mean just income, I mean wealth, I mean educational, I mean social, you're bound to have less symmetry in society. You eventually get a society of masters and serfs. Let's take Augustus or Octavian when he began. He had a fortune. He could pay mercenaries. He could have supporters, distribute materials, spread rumors. And he could do so because by that time, Rome was highly unequal. So any republic, and this country is no exception. I just wrote a chapter on Anglo-Saxon populism, and it is interesting to note, even in the 19th century, this was a country of farmers, and you didn't have huge farms, and it was a largely egalitarian country. And the reason it was a democracy and Europe wasn't was because in the US, yes, the natives got, too bad, they got bumped off, and of course African Americans were slaves for a while, but the European immigrants could always have land and some equity and some parity in status. So my belief is it'll hinge fundamentally on economic pain and inequality. And as of now, Southeast Asia is in trouble.
Well, the reason I balanced stability and democracy is because there may be perceived to be a trade-off between the two. And has there been a decline in democracy accompanied by, or maybe an upsurge in stability at the price of a downward motion of democracy?
I don't know if it's a false choice. To cut to it, that's a red herring to play stability versus demography. Well, you've got plenty of tyrannies in the Middle East, and the Middle East and North Africa are not entirely exceedingly stable. You come to Thailand and you have lese-majesty laws, and you can be locked up for saying anything against the king, and the current king is famous for little else but being a debauched playboy. He isn't even a stylish playboy.
The ultimate failing.
So yeah, the ultimate. We have Frenchmen, in the audience. They could go to France to learn lessons. But the point is that has that brought stability? No, it hasn't. So there is not always this stability, that neat, what they draw up in Harvard Kennedy School, these neat matrices, stability, democracy, yada, yada. It doesn't work like that. It depends on the context. Democracy can be exceedingly stable if you have the continuity of a very long parliamentary tradition. The Brits are a classic example of it. They didn't suffer revolution after 1688. The Glorious Revolution is the last upheaval they have. The French went through, the guillotine and whatnot, which was the kiss of, which was like a kiss on the neck, of course. But, as the inventor put it. But the point is, upheaval in Europe happened, and it happened precisely because perhaps there were aspirations for democracy and equity which weren't met by the elites, whilst England escaped it. So it depends, I think, on the country.
Ian, one of the points that you raised, which I thought was really fascinating, was the impact and importance of the Sunni-Shia divide. And I hope we get a chance to hear more about that. And one of the things that I wanted to have the group here hear about is whether one is more democratic than the other, or is it the same?
Yes, well, that's an interesting way of putting it.
That's very
Before
polite of
I
you.
get to that, I'm just going to comment on something Atul said about the lack of upheavals in Britain since 1688. Of course, Britain went through a whole series of upheavals before that as we struggled for democracy there, with riots being the main way that democracy was carried forward. The massive Gordon riots, the Corn Laws, the democracy riots, the riots
Peterloo Massacre.
Peterloo Massacre in 1914, 1910, and most recently the poll tax riots under Mrs. Thatcher. This is the way the Brits get democracy, is when they don't like what's going on in Parliament, they take to the streets and burn things down. And they do. And so democracy's been hard won in Britain. And for years and years we looked to America as the beacon of democracy, and I'm afraid that beacon is not as bright as it once was. People here take democracy for granted, and they talk about Abraham Lincoln as a great democrat, which he was. But he was a dramatic example to the Brits, because he was a man who came from very lowly beginnings, log cabin, and he rose to be President of the United States. That would never, ever have happened in any European country in the 19th century. Totally impossible. And for it to happen in America was a tremendous beacon, and that's why, that's not the only reason, but America projected enormous soft power and attracted people for that, amongst many other reasons. So I have some strong feelings about that. But to move on to Sunnis and Shias, very dear to my heart. I lived for 3 years in Iran, and followed the Middle East and the Sunni-Shia divide for many years since. I like the Shias. The Shias are a bit like the Catholic Church. They have a hierarchy. They have ayatollahs and Ayatollah al-Uzma and Hujjat al-Islams. So it's like bishops, archbishops, all the way down to parish priests. And they have this same sort of sense of guilt and martyrdom and shrines and relics and pilgrimage, and all of those things are built into Shia Islam. So the Shia and the Catholics have just got a lot in common, and they've had their same sexual scandals as well. One of the nice things that attracted me about, because of the tradition of pilgrimage, that if you're a Shia, when you're on pilgrimage and you get to the shrine that you're visiting, you're allowed to take a temporary wife, in fact up to 4 temporary wives. And you can sign your temporary wife on for as little as 10 minutes or as much as a day and a half. Yeah. So I thought they were very, very accommodating about that. So I have some sympathy for that. The Sunnis, the Sunnis of course claim orthodoxy, and they regard the Shias as heretics, and we don't need to go into the origins of that. But the divide is very strong, and the divide is driven not just by confessional differences and differences over doctrine, the same sort of differences that drove the Eastern Church away from the Catholic Church and all those sorts of things. But they're driven very much by cultural issues as well. And of course, because Shia Islam is very much associated with Iran, it gets tied to the cultural issues that Iran has. And Iran, the Iranians know that they are wildly superior to the Arabs. They know that the Arab culture really all derives from Persian culture, the poetry, the architecture, the food, the literature. Everything goes back to the Persians, and the Persians know it and delight in telling the Arabs at every opportunity about it, which really gets up their nose, as I'm sure you know. And what's more, the Arabs conquered the Iranians, and then the Iranians came back and conquered the Arabs. culturally, if not militarily. And at the moment we have this situation where the Arabs have got lots of money, the Gulfies I should say, not all of the Arabs, and there is Iran growing very rapidly and very demonstratively across the Gulf, which poses not just a military threat, but a cultural threat, an economic threat, a very existential threat. And those threats are being seen through the lens not just of a geopolitical struggle, but through this confessional struggle as well. So I think this is going to be played out in the years to come. And we're going to see lots of Sunni Shia, well, lots more Sunni Shia proxy wars in Lebanon, on the borders of Israel, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on, if not a major confrontation across the Gulf itself, which I regret to say I do not see the Americans spending a lot of time in trying to prevent. In fact, you might say they may even be trying to urge it on. Does that answer your question? Sorry, John.
Yes, Ian, I wanted to comment on your theory about how democracy emerges. I had a very good friend who was the Undersecretary of State for International Organizations under Carter. One of his responsibilities was to oversee Andy Young, who is an African American. The Republicans sort of branded him as a wild man. He was constantly on the defensive. He wasn't a wild man. He was very moderate and shrewd. But he used to tell my friend Bill that when he was going around to governors' mansions across the South, when the governors were inclined to give him some of the things that he was looking for, at the very end, the governor would turn to Andy Young and said, "But don't stop the rioting in the street."
I'm wondering if I can follow up quickly
Yes,
on
sure.
something he said.
Yes.
Actually, two pieces to this. One is, I think it's true that we believe in this country that our democracy is tied to social mobility and the American dream and the idea that anyone can make it. What some of our more recent research on social mobility is showing us is that actually we have less now than modern Europe does. And that,
Right.
I think, says a lot about what's happening in this country in terms of the economic inequality and also what's happening in Europe. I think there's been a change in Europe since 100 years ago. The other thing that I want to touch on actually goes back to what you just said about Andy Young as well. Part of what's going on in this country has to be recognized as a concern over race and race fears in this country. And that is driven in part by the fact that the demography of America is changing. And it's changing pretty dramatically. And there's undeniably a group of people in this country who are afraid that as our country becomes a country of many, people of many different colors and not predominantly white, that means that they're going to lose out, that they're going to get less, that the things that they believe that they should have, they'll no longer have. And we just have to acknowledge that that is a part of what's happening with democracy in this country, and it drove a lot of what happened in the last elections. But conversely, that change in demography is happening. And while there are undoubtedly efforts to suppress the vote, there's a limit to how much you can do that, And at some point, demographic change is going to have a really big impact on a lot of our democratic institutions. I think what our democracy will look like in 10 years is going to be very different than what it'll look like in 30 years, in part because of that.
John, what is your take on Eastern Europe? My observation, for what it's worth, is that there have been some lurches away from democracy and the rule of law. And in the future, do you think these will be the exceptions or the rule?
Well, first, I want to add something to what Deb said on demography in the United States. As he was coming close to ending his time in office, Barack Obama said something very interesting. He said, I shouldn't have been elected until 2028. The fact that I was elected before that time was an anomaly, because the demography in the United States would have dictated that only in 2028, only when the complexion, if you will, of the United States had changed that dramatically, would someone like me, Barack Obama, have the opportunity to be elected. And I think much of what we saw in the last election speaks to his preemptive, if you will, rise to the presidency and the reaction to that. Also, what we saw in the last election, I think, could have been seen in Eastern Europe and was seen in Eastern Europe. The rise of this so-called illiberal populism. We saw it first with the election of Viktor Orban and Fidesz in 2010. We saw it more recently with the election of PiS, or the Law and Justice Party in Poland. It's something that's not specific to a particular political party or ideology. In other words, Fidesz had been liberal, switched all the way over to the other side of the spectrum, declared themselves conservative. PiS, or Law and Justice Party in Poland, always proudly declared themselves conservative. Robert Fico in Slovakia, on the other hand, calls himself a socialist, puts himself on the left side of the political spectrum, but he too betrays the same populist or illiberal populist tendencies. Why did this kind of movement happen in Eastern Europe, and why did it happen in many ways before similar trends have emerged in Western Europe, and certainly here in the United States with the rise of Trump? Well, I would say it's because all of these countries, all countries around the world, have been experiencing the same economic transformations roughly since 1989. We tend to think of Eastern Europe as having gone through a transition, that they are special, that they are coming out of communism and they transitioned, if you will, to market economies. But the same process has been going on for all countries, maybe perhaps not as dramatic, not as telescoped as what happened in Eastern Europe, but nonetheless, we've all seen greater kind of moves toward the market, away from state intervention in the market, greater privatization, the kind of realization of, you can either call it the neoliberal revolution of the late 1970s or the Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the 1980s. In Eastern Europe, it was a project that was endorsed by both sides of the political spectrum, by the left and the right, by both of the so-called mainstream parties. And what that led to was a disaffection among the populace for mainstream parties. They said, look, if the left or the right both support these lousy economic reforms that have brought unemployment rates up into the 20%, have destroyed our manufacturing capabilities, have brought in foreign corporations to control our industries, well, the hell with these parties. The hell with these mainstream parties. We're going to go with somebody else, somebody who promises us something entirely different. And what they came up with, or what these parties came up with, was a mix of left economic policies and right-wing social policies. That is the kind of hybrid that Fidesz has provided in Hungary, Law and Justice in Poland, Fico in Slovakia, and increasingly throughout the region. So the question is this a blip? Is this going to be kind of standard operating procedure for not only Eastern Europe, but for all of Europe? Well, I think there will be, and there has been, a reaction politically to all of these populist parties, but the problem is, and I'll end here, that these populist movements are very smart about not just political power and making sure that they have consolidated this political party power by making constitutional changes, by, as the Republican Party has done here, gerrymandering to preserve their position in their countries, but economic power as well, so that they deliver the goods. They don't just deliver the goods necessarily to the population at large. They deliver the goods to their own clientelist group within the party, within even smaller than that, a kind of clique or claque that is around the populist leader themselves. so that they are able to preserve a 30 to 35% strong support within the population. If that sounds familiar, of course that is something we see here in the United States as well. And it's a question of whether these parties can then, at election time, go from that 30 to 35% to the necessary additional votes they need to stay in political power. So unfortunately, I think that these populist movements are here to stay for at least the medium term in Eastern Europe, and the greater threat is the degree to which they spread not only to the rest of Europe, but as we see from Duterte, from Ortega in Nicaragua, Erdogan in Turkey, the degree to which it spreads throughout the world.
May I just jump in? I think if we are going to look at democracy, and I'm glad John mentioned 1989. 7 November 1989, Ian was in Copenhagen. That's the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that is a time of euphoria. That is a time when you have people going from Oxford and Cambridge, Heidelberg, Paris. Everyone goes to get a piece of the wall. And a very clever chap named Francis Fukuyama writes The End of History and the Last Man. And there was this real belief that markets will solve all our problems, evil communism has gone, and we will privatize, and efficiency will come, and initiative will come, and we will all sing Kumbaya. The reality is that when the Soviet Union collapses, and that's on Christmas Day, 1991, so a lot of people, although they may not have said it aloud, feel that the evil empire, which is what the Cold War declared and deemed the Soviet Union to be, is gone. And there is a hubris, and I come from the old world. I come from the oldest living city in the world, Varanasi. So we are skeptical of any ideology. We are skeptical of any claim. We have seen empires rise and fall, and we recognize that society comprises many interest groups. And what is democracy but a collection of the biggest number of interest groups which trump other ones? So the Conservative Party usually got 30% of the vote, correct me if I'm wrong, throughout the 20th century, even after voting reform, even after votes went to women. And Churchill, who was nearly thrown under a non-Russian train by a suffragette, said he would have been for giving votes to women had he realized how many of them would have voted for him. So the reality is...
Principled fellow.
Yeah, a very principled fellow, of course. But the point is, and the point I'm getting to is this, that is the nature of democracy. Democracies work if you have some kind of social contract, some kind of collective identity. So the British had some form of collective identity in the sense they would go and, at least fight the French in Agincourt. And in Agincourt, they had a far more democratic army than the French aristocracy. So democracy worked sort of in Germany after the Second World War, not before the Second World War. The same country. Right. The same country in the 1920s had a struggling Weimar Republic, and the Weimar Republic constitution is a very democratic and enlightened one. But it didn't solve the problems of the people, and so on and so forth. So the point is, after 1991, the market system that came into being forgot that even Adam Smith talked about moral sentiments. So privatization in Russia was simply theft. And of course, people were murdered, people were shot, people were conveniently found dead in the Volga. In Eastern Europe, the violence was not as macabre, but then they haven't suffered Mongol invasions. But it was a similar process. It was fundamental redistribution of public property into private hands, into cousins twice removed or nephews twice removed. And people lost faith, people have over time lost faith, both in the market per se, that's why they turned left, and they've lost faith in the political processes, because the political processes, the third way of a lovely chap called Bill Clinton, and another chap called Tony Blair, didn't just go wrong, it never admitted that it went wrong. It is okay to go wrong because you make a bet and you think the market will unleash productivity, and it does. Steve Jobs deciding everything in Apple did lead to an efficient system. I talk about the equity efficiency paradigm all the time. It's messier if 5 people have opinions and 10 people have opinions. So it's efficient often if you have that, a little bit of inequality and all that jazz. But there's always a trade-off. And perhaps what they thought was that in the unleashing of productivity would raise living standards. Inequality was not such a big thing because we saw the example of the Soviet Union and it didn't lead to any good. And that was a binary way of looking at it. People didn't recognize there was certain good in the old economies. And things like the Glass-Steagall Act, which FDR had brought in, were repealed. Or let's say FDR's allies had brought in Congress. And Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act came. And none other than a senator from Minnesota warned against repealing it. It was Byron Dorgan. You can watch that clip on YouTube. And he said this will lead to collapse, this will lead to too many mergers, this will lead to speculation. And so what I'm saying is that we are seeing the failure of the promise of the end of the Cold War, and the anger is leading to a reaction both against the dominant economic model and against political systems worldwide.
Is Veena here?
Yeah.
Hi, Veena.
Hi.
Veena contributed a lot of thinking behind this panel, particularly to me. And would you mind if I asked you a question?
Sure.
To put you on the spot. Will the tensions between the Republican Congress or the Republican Party and Trump improve or worsen over the course of his presidency? And how likely is it that Trump will split from the party or vice versa?
I think there are a lot of qualified people to speak to that. I think that we are already seeing that splintering taking place today. Though for many of us, perhaps not as quickly as we might have expected, we might have expected or hoped that some Republicans would turn against what has been a rather brazen economic agenda, a lot of it driven by xenophobia,
Right.
very plainly stated. So I don't know, I think that there's a lot of evidence that there are people behind the scenes, including Pence and others, who are trying to account for Plan B, trying to put in motion Plan B. And so I think that's more likely to accelerate over time. We're seeing a lot of disarray within his cabinet as well. So I think it's more likely to be strained over time, but at the same time to stay together in some sort of loose arrangement, because at least for now they both feel like they can
Exploit each other,
right?
Yeah.
Play upon
Right.
Trump's populism while at the same time using it to drive forth an economic agenda that's been a priority for a long time, and now maybe they were hoping had some of the momentum to push through with them holding both bodies of Congress and the president.
To your first point, I tried to remind people who have that same feeling of why hasn't it broken apart earlier, like during the primaries. It took 18 months before the first Republican broke from Nixon. And these things just take time, in my view. And so I'm sort of optimistic that it is happening as soon as it is, whereas so many other people are saying, why didn't this happen earlier?
May I
Yes.
add on to that? So the last time I counted, there were 7 different investigations of the Russia issue and the campaign and other aspects of the presidency. 5 of them were congressional committees. There's the special prosecutor. There's at least 1 other administrative investigation, and there might be a couple more that I'm not thinking of. I think the last month we've seen a real change. We saw the Congress not enacting the health bill that he wanted. And what's really important about that is not that 3 Republicans in the Senate voted against it, but that the Republican leadership in the Senate and I think in the House have pretty much said, okay, we're done. We're moving on to tax reform.
I'll tell you, I have a sinister view of this, and some of the pessimists here.
Well,
which is that, and I'll let you go on, but is that McConnell is smarter than Trump, and he's waiting until McCain dies, and then they're going to bring it back up.
the technical reason why that doesn't work is that in order to do tax reform, they need reconciliation.
Right.
And the moment they pass a budget resolution that gives them that fast track process for tax reform, it voids their ability to pass health care with 51 votes in the Senate. So if they're going to go ahead and do tax reform on the fast track process, they can't do health care this year with 51 votes.
Unless the budget takes so long that John McCain, his life expectancy is a month. This is very morbid, I'm sorry to say. but-
Oh, it's 14 months.
Oh, is it? Good.
It is.
You're in healthcare.
I'm not in healthcare, but I'm following the Senate votes very closely.
Okay.
The other thing I'll tell you is that his governor, who is a Republican, would appoint his replacement, and his governor had 3 Medicaid amendments that he wanted that McCain was going to put in. So it is not clear to me, even if McCain dies, that the senator that comes in, although he'll be a conservative Republican in many ways, will vote for the health care package that
I
Congress
interrupted
wants.
you, and you get a great answer. So resume, please.
So it's not just that they didn't pass health care, it's that they have chosen to move on, even though Trump doesn't want it. It is not just that there are all these investigations going on, but there have been a number of different signals from Congress that Trump may not fire the special prosecutor or fire Jeff Sessions in order to get someone to fire the special prosecutor. And that's really big because it is increasingly looking like the special prosecutor is going to find things that they can impeach the president for. I don't know how many of you saw today's news, but the day after Congress had done a hearing with Paul Manafort, the president's former campaign manager, they executed a warrant on his house to get documents. A warrant means that a judge found there was probable cause to show that there was a crime committed, and not only that, but they did a no-knock warrant where they went in, and I believe they did it not in the middle of the day, like I think it was
No,
like
early morning.
Early morning.
6 o'clock.
That's quite a dramatic thing, particularly with a witness who has apparently been cooperating. So there are some reasons to believe that Republicans in the House and the Senate, even though there's a lot of things that go along with them on, are drawing some very strong lines. And, whether that'll continue, I don't know, but I think that is likely to, and I particularly think it's likely to because we are slowly but steadily seeing a drop in the strength of his support.
Right.
Not necessarily people who support him, but the strength of it. And at some point they're going to say, am I going to lose more votes because I hurt Trump and tried to impeach him, or because I didn't turn against him when it looked like he had tried to sell our country out?
I'd like to move on now because we were actually about to approach the first question that Atul posed for us. Focused on apathy and ignorance. And to just move quickly, do any of us think that there is generally apathy on the left? And I realize that we're covering the whole globe here. Yes.
Yes. I just want to make a comment on the Russian investigation first, is that if the Russians do indeed have something on Trump, we're going to find out about it soon. I like to tell the story about a colleague of mine in the British Foreign Service who unfortunately found himself in a brothel in Russia, which was lovingly being filmed by the Russian special services. And when he failed to cooperate with them to their wishes, they put the video on YouTube. So the Russians play play very badly. So if the Russians want to do something, they'll give evidence to the special prosecutor. We can wait for that. But to go to the question of apathy, I think one of the the defining moment of the last few years was the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and if ever there was a time when something should have been done to correct the imbalances and the problems that we had, that would have been it. And as I said earlier on, I think the failure of liberal democracy to provide the things that we expect it to in terms of economic security, healthcare, education, growing prosperity, and to curb corruption, both political corruption and the corruption of the, you might say, the banking class and their connections to the political class. This should have been the moment when a popular politician should have come to power and done something about it. Now, there was that great wave of hope when Obama was elected that he was going to be that man. There was going to be change, there was going to be, the system was going to be fixed. But that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Was this Obama's fault, or was it the fault of the apathy that took hold after he came to power? But it is a great pity that that opportunity was wasted, and that we had 8 years of Obama, who did lots of good things, a very good man, but he didn't fix the system. All the things that were done were channeled through the same old system, and we ended up now, 8 years, 9 years later, with basically the same system we had in 2008, and we know it failed us, and yet we're now stuck with something that is being used in a way that many of us dislike intensely. And those that felt that liberal democracy failed them have now turned to something else. And I'm not surprised by that. And that's not because of apathy. That's because people have actually said, well, we gave you a chance. You didn't take it. We are now going to do something else. And they were motivated to go and vote for it.
John, do you think there's apathy on the right?
I was going to first talk about the left, but
Okay.
I'll get to the right. I think there was apathy on the left for about 12 hours after the election. Whether you want to call it apathy or absolute disgust is hard to say, but there certainly was a paralysis, I think, as the left was like, how could this happen? And the fact that it dissipated is borne out by one simple fact, and that is that the left did not move en masse to New Zealand, because that was what the expectation was. I mean, people were saying, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, who said not that she would, but if her husband were still alive, if Trump were elected, they'd both move to New Zealand. And everybody started saying, well, God, if this happens, of course we get out of this country. But very few people, in fact, did leave the country. And instead, they've been, I think, the left has been incredibly energized across the issue spectrum, whether we're talking about inequality questions, we're talking about immigration questions, race issues, even foreign policy issues, war and peace questions.
And I think across economic groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The right, and I'll just be very brief about the right, and whether there's an apathy. I think there is a certain amount of apathy among certain sectors of the right. I would say, for instance, moderate Republicans who have seen the disappearance of their representatives in Congress and are not sure like who they can turn to. I mean, there are a couple of, there's Susan Collins, there's occasionally Murkowski, occasionally people who appear to represent moderate Republican views, but they are increasingly a species on they're on the endangered species list. They're on the verge of extinction. So I think there is a degree of apathy there. I don't see any, I mean, we did mention that among Trump supporters, there's a weakening of not so much whether they would continue to vote for Trump or not, but the degree of their enthusiasm for Trump. That might be, but I tend to think that any time Trump gets on Twitter, anytime there is a perceived attack of the fake media against Trump's policies, it re-energizes that base. So that, I mean, whether the right is apathetic really depends on what segment of the right we're talking about here in the United States.
May,
Atul, and
No,
your
let's go
second.
first.
oh, okay. So I actually brought a little display about the left. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but it's the United States of Resistance. It's a map you can go online and find. And I think it shows you how very far from apathetic the left is, because it's broken down into people getting involved in elections, taking to the streets, engaged in action, finding a local group you want to work with, getting informed. And for each of them, it has different activities. These are all groups that have basically arisen in the last 8 months. I'm happy to show it to people afterwards. And they tend to be connected and work together in a way that I don't think we've seen in prior efforts. And a lot of it is very local. The Women's March ended up recommending that people form what they called local huddles to decide what to do locally. So did a group called Indivisible, and people have local actions that they develop. One of the real differences between marches now and marches historically is the marches all used to be in DC. They all used to be focused on showing up on the mall. And now every time there's a march in DC, there are marches all over the country that are locally organized and that are in some ways more important, because a legislator in Utah or Nevada or Alabama is going to assume that everybody in DC is from progressive parts of the country and they're not their constituents. But a march that's in their state capital, they know that's their constituents and they need to respond to that. So I think we've actually seen a lot of mobilization on the left, along with some depression, but I wouldn't call it apathy. Conversely, if you look at the right, they don't show up. They call marches and there's a handful of people there. When help
But
calls,
they're spending money.
the very rich are, yes, but if we're talking about popular opinion,
Yeah.
I think you are seeing apathy on the right. And you're not when you ask people for members of Congress for their phone call tallies, the calls that came in to support the current healthcare system were huge. There were all, you would expect that a lot of people were going to lose healthcare, but there were almost none from the right, from the people who were saying no, you have to get rid of it. When you looked at the town halls, it was not a combination of left and right. It was all right. So I think on the right you are seeing apathy. The other thing that's very interesting goes back to this issue of the press and people being very, the broad discussions of, the fake news, the alt media, all of that. One of the things we are seeing that might be a long-term trend, and I'm very curious to see whether it is that the viewership for Fox News is down. The viewership for MSNBC and CNN is way up. Breitbart
Passed it the first time, a month ago, first time in history of the competition.
Right, and not only that, but while we don't know how many people,
Excuse me, I'd love to see your statistics on that.
I'll find them for you after
I
the.
just read something in the paper just yesterday.
No,
Suggested-
this is Nielsen, this is the ratings, this is,
Well, this is Margaret Sullivan's column that suggested precisely the opposite is true. That in fact, the audience for Fox continues to rise, continues to remain double, triple what the total audience and cable television audience is by huge numbers.
I just think that's inaccurate.
Well, I hope
And
it's
I,
inaccurate,
if you
but I don't
want,
see any
if you want, if you give me your email address, I'll send you the citations to this.
And I'm happy to talk about it afterwards too, but I do just want to say, if you look at the ads on Breitbart, the number of advertisers is way down. And that, even though they don't tell you how many people actually go to their website and look, that is really telling about whether whether there's a lot of people going there. They can't draw the advertisers because people aren't going there.
We have a question.
I just want, if I could make a broader point about cable news. I mean, cable news viewership is, to put it bluntly, minuscule compared to, in total, compared to that of the broadcast networks and other news outlets. So I wouldn't use that as a barometer of
What about
anybody's
talk
political
radio?
opinion.
What about talk radio?
Perhaps, but the cable news, I mean.
He's
you're
a former
talk-
journalist, so
You're
he
talking
knows.
about, you're talking, I mean, if you compare, I'm kind of talking off the top of my head right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if you picked NBC, CBS, or ABC's the size of their news audience I wouldn't be surprised to see any one of those three networks' audience be greater than the total audience for all cable news
Right.
channels.
Right.
You may be right, but what I'm really talking about is the trend, and the trend is down on the conservative
But it's a
press.
trend on it's a trend that exists among a very small segment of the American population. Most Americans, to put it bluntly, are not sitting around watching CNN, NBC, MSNBC, or Fox.
May I jump in?
Yes, but I want to be really short, because I
Sure.
want to move on to some other things.
Okay.
We're
So
run behind.
very
But-
quickly,
Go ahead.
I'll go back to this issue of left and right. When I teach in Berkeley, most students don't have a political point of view. They're not members of the party. Most students are just terrified of getting a job. And most students don't want to engage with ideas. In fact, they haven't even read most of the thinkers. People who go to Harvard and Yale don't know who Max Weber was or Friedrich Engels was. Forget other smaller universities. So that is certainly true. And what is the other thing which I find for me, picking off from what Ian said, 2007, 2008 was the moment which my dear friend Olivier Lavinal would call kairos, the moment where you could bend the arc of time and an FDR could have emerged. But what happened instead was socialism on the downside, capitalism on the upside, which means, well, we made a loss, the taxpayer will foot the bill. And we'll take bonuses from taxpayer money. How lovely. Brilliant. C'est très bien. This gets even better. This gets more interesting. And I said this to Tim Geithner, who doesn't probably like me very much. I said, under your reign, too big to fail has become even bigger to fail. He was Treasury Secretary. And moral hazard, that economic jargon for, very simply, if you don't pay the costs of if you have fire insurance, you don't put as much effort in preparing for a fire or keeping your house fireproof, especially if the insurance is pretty decent. And moral hazard actually has gone up. And you look at the amounts, and Obama said this when he was running for re-election, the amount that hedge fund managers took. The fact that you have carried interest is a scandal, is a damned bloody scandal. 15% carried interest is what carried interest. 15% is what hedge fund managers pay as tax, and their secretaries will pay a higher tax rate. So I think there is profound inequality, and that inequality, in some ways, more regulation has helped the bigger boys, because they can hire the Harvard and Yale educated lawyers.
Can I add just one point there?
One, and then I really am
Very
going to
short.
move on.
Just
1 minute.
Just to illustrate, I mean, just as a statistic, in 1978, the median ratio between a CEO and a secretary's salary
Yes.
was about 22 to 1. This year, it's 445 to 1. That's the median ratio for a large corporation. And this, I think, illustrates the fundamental issues that we're facing that
Right.
should have been corrected. But what has the left been focusing on in the past few years? Not on this economic tragedy that we're facing, but they've been banging on about gay marriage, police violence, abortion rights, climate change, the feminist agenda, all that sort of stuff. And I think ignoring the most fundamental issue that we're facing.
We put out a CEO report every year for the last 15 years, talking about nothing but that issue. We were delighted when Bernie started talking about it.
Yeah.
And it suddenly got some play. So I would say that to a certain extent the left has been talking about it,
Right.
but other issues get more prominence for reasons that would be interesting to talk about.
But they have no big ideas. It's very incoherent as yet. There is not like the 1930s when you had the Keynesian idea. The left is still very splintered and incoherent.
Okay, I want to move on. The question was about apathy and ignorance. We've talked about apathy. I'm just going to say 3 things about education, and then I'm going to move on to the second half of our panel. First, the role of education. governments control education to varying degrees, a challenge. Second, the role of the press, and now the social media. And there the government tries to control the press, more difficult to control social media, but government wants to do that. The last thing is to say about it, and then I will just move on, is that this control of the press, which I think is the biggest bulwark against abuse and corruption, and one of the biggest problems with respect to prosperity, which Atul and a number of you have mentioned. And it's always on the defensive. It has very few defenders. Myself, I'm not sure that it defends itself in the most effective ways it could. But having said that, we've now covered what the problems are, and the question is what to do about it. And I'm just going to ask the questions, and then you all can pitch in, and then we'll get to something a little more specific after that. How should citizens mobilize? Deb?
I think one of the things that's different and new and is working is that the mobilization is neither top-down, which we had for a very long time, or purely horizontal and disorganized, which is what you saw in Occupy, but rather that there are a number of different groups, some of them providing information, but the folks at the ground level are actually deciding what issues they want to work on. And that has actually been a pretty powerful model, at least in the last 7 or 8 months, which is why I brought the chart, actually. I will just add to that the key thing that people need to make sure they do is tell people when it worked. Because if people know it works, they'll keep doing it. And so it's particularly critical to emphasize when there are victories.
Atul?
I think eventually it boils down over the long run to education. And by education, I don't mean people becoming exam monkeys, writing their SATs, their GREs, their GMATs, and going through the watering holes of Harvard and Yale to McKinsey and Goldman Sachs. That for me is the modern day trade school travesty of what education should be. Education, ideally, to use the words of Rabindranath Tagore, who people know as a Nobel laureate, but really he is the Shakespeare of Bangla. And he said, you know, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. And he talked about education giving people the ability to think critically, giving people the courage of conviction in their beliefs, standing up for their ideas, and so on and so forth. The idea of people developing into fully mature, or let's say more mature than they are, more capable human beings who think of society as a whole as well, and in particular, those who go to elite schools, if they have noblesse oblige, because we always, as societies, look up to these institutions, even when we disparage them. And so going back, we'll have to invest in some kind of civic education, and I see the press as part of that education, and it is very instructive to note, according to the Pew Research report of 2014, and the numbers have got worse, there are 5 jobs in public relations for every job in journalism. And social media is noise. Social media demonstrably limits your ability to think critically, and it has enabled a 140 character precedent as a result. Social media will never be a replacement. You can always hire social media managers if you have money.
You do.
So you do. And so the point is, eventually it is, again, some kind of reflection, some kind of change in consciousness, some kind of social conscience has to be reawakened.
You've answered the question I was about to ask, but I'm going to go on to the question of of how citizens should mobilize?
Well, mobilize for what purpose? I take a rather dystopian view about this, because I regret to say I think that citizens are going to mobilize in the wrong direction for tribalist and rather unfortunate reasons. I mean,
Well,
particularly if you look at
clarify the question, to combat the decline of democracy.
Yeah, no, well, I
tough.
think we're watching an upsurge of democracy. Take Europe, for example. The biggest challenge facing Europe at the moment is the migration crisis. We've seen one aspect of that with the exodus from Syria and the political reaction that's had in the rest of Europe. This political reaction is not the result of apathy or ignorance.
Right.
It's the result of this xenophobic desire to keep these immigrants out.
Fear.
And I think the same is going on here too. I think I think it'll get worse in Europe because climate change is beginning to affect Egypt, with the Nile Delta beginning to disappear. Already, as much as 30 miles inland, the water is too salty to irrigate the crops or to
Same
drink.
is true in South Asia.
Yeah.
We could pull examples from around the world.
And you're going to get millions more wanting to get into Europe as a result. And I think the reaction of the Europeans is going to be to try to shut them out. And that's not a result of apathy, but it's a result of xenophobia. And I think you've seen the same reaction here. So I think there's a great deal of mobilization going on, but it's mobilization in the wrong direction. And whilst I very much applaud the efforts to oppose these totalitarian solutions to these problems and to keep the flame of liberty and knowledge and education alive, we have to do that. But I regret to say I think we are going to fail in our effort to do that.
John, how should the society mobilize, and what should its focus be on?
Well, I was struck. Well, I'm struck by a lot of things all of you said, but I was struck, Atul, when you said that there are no big ideas that have emerged from the left. I think you were specifying, and I would differ on that issue because I think there have been big ideas, and those big ideas relate to the greater threats that we face as a planet. So that could be climate change, that could be economic inequality, that could be a variety of pandemics that face us. In other words, the big idea that I think is emerging is that all the little ideas that
Right.
provided for mobilization in the past are insufficient at this moment. We are at a critical moment for humanity as a whole when we face issues that are transnational and that face us all regardless of where we come from. What it requires, and this I think addresses your point, is, and this goes back to where I was schooled in my political education, that's Poland, solidarity, 1970s. What is required is solidarity, a recognition that it's not just me, that I'm not just kind of out there championing my own rights. I might be doing that, but I see the interrelationship between my rights and your rights. The Poles used to say, for your freedom and for ours. That was the principle by which they organized. I will work on your behalf, not because of charity, but because I see that your struggle is my struggle. And that when I work for both of us. And I think that's what's missing in civic movement. It's not missing completely, but it's where I would push
Yeah,
in
very
terms
well
of civic organizing.
And if I may just comment on that, that's the modern concept of intersectionality, which you'll hear a lot of in the resistance. I'll go out this week on a march about the environment. I'll go out next week on a march for taxes. I have to say this is the first time in 20 years of working on tax justice and more progressive taxes that I've had an opportunity to go out and say, we should pay more in taxes. We should tax the rich. I've never had a march like that before. But the whole idea of intersectionality is very much the solidarity idea.
But,
Oh, sorry.
the last question is, what are the next steps to take? And actually, the discussion we've had has led up here without any design on my part to work out pretty well. And we've talked about some and I'm going to list about 7 or so. One of them we've talked about. The model is climate change. Does that require solidarity? Does that require a broader, more integral view of what our responsibilities are? And so that's one choice. The role of multinational corporations. I would say thus far pretty disappointing, but maybe not. The role of the UN and other international agencies, that's sort of 3. That's number 3. Foreign aid. Education, which Atul addressed. Is this a global or local or an intertwining? And then one of the things that kind of interests me is the Silicon Valley mentality something that's going to change how we think about these things? And there are Silicon Valley cultures growing up in lots of different countries. And they worry about things that I don't think businessmen have worried about in the past, is how do you change the world for the better? They're all believers in that, whether they're hypocrites or not. It's a new mindset. Anyway, so pick one of them and address the one you would care to address in that, or come up with another one.
Well, I think it's pretty clear already that I think global and local is intertwined.
Right.
So I will say about climate change that I think that is particularly true on the climate change front. And that one of the most striking things about what happened after Trump said we're pulling out of the Paris Accord, which, by the way, as far as I know, we have not actually done.
Can't do it for 2 years.
And he hasn't taken any of the steps you'd need to.
Right.
But what was striking was how many states, localities, committed themselves to living by the Paris Accord anyway. It was a huge percentage of this country. And then on top of it, there's a fair amount of belief, and I am not a technical person, so I can't tell you if it's correct, that our technology changes are going to lead us to comply with the Paris Accord anyway, without too much governmental engagement on that. So I think climate change is a really good example of how this happens at many different levels. And I will add, particularly around democracy in the US, that one of the really interesting things that's been happening over the last 8 or 9 months is how important the role of the states has become. I find it very ironic. 150 years ago, the states were trying to leave the country, split off because they wanted to support slavery and other not progressive things. And right now, the states are really leading a lot of the fight towards more progressive things. The Democratic Attorney General's Association, if you go to their website, has a phrase more or less to the effect of, they are the front line in fighting for our rights. And they talk every week. So part of what's protecting democracy in our country is not only the very well-known balance of power between the administrative role, the legislative role, and the judiciary, and that is clearly at work, but also the different levels of government, the federal, the state, and localities that are producing sanctuary cities, for example. And I think you see that in climate change, but you see it in a lot of places.
I'm going to go to John because he always gets the dregs and turns it into gold.
Actually, I was gonna pass because I already gave my thoughts on climate change, and it'd be great to get more time for the audience.
Ian?
I'll be very brief. I think I have again some concerns that the issues that you raised, the issue of the very large wealthy corporations and are they making policy rather than governments. I think that's true. Climate change, which is a global challenge, what are we doing about it? And the dramatic change in technology that we've witnessed over certainly the last 20 years. I'm not sure that democracy and the systems we have at the moment are up to the challenges of facing a failure here. And as I go back to, we saw this in 2007, 2008, when we almost had a dramatic failure, but we escaped it. We stepped back from the brink, but we didn't change the system. And I think if there were to be a similar dramatic failure in the internet, for example, And if that went down globally, would our systems be able to cope with that? I have my doubts. And have we ever managed to challenge the power of the wealthy international corporations? We're struggling with that too. Just on the tax issue, we're not doing very well. And then climate change, as we know, the climate is changing around us, and the response of the world has been lukewarm, too late. We've certainly done something, but I don't think we've actually met the challenge. So I think something rather more radical has got to happen before we can actually deal with the issues that we're facing.
So, John, you've already talked about reforming political systems, and political systems have evolved and have atrophied, actually, and haven't functioned in various parts of the world, from the Philippine elite, the English-speaking Indian elite, to the Turkish elite, and we've had reactions. But I will address just one thing, and this is something my friend Olivier Lavinal and I talk a lot about, and that is coming up with an alternative economic system. We cannot have a consumption-based model anymore. I think a lot of talk is done about climate change in jargon. And the jargon is, we want to stop global warming, okay, X percentage, which is actually a very high number. Nearly 60% of vertebrates have died in the last 4 years. You get all these numbers thrown around, but people sort of still continue to live the way they want. And we know that the economic system today is very good at giving you lots of stuff, but life is more than stuff. We have major mismatches between demand and supply. So what is there a supply of today? Well, you go to Walmart and Chinese factories are sending you goods by the cheap. Most of them are trinkets meant for people like Caliban, to quote good old William Shakespeare. There is no dearth of supply there, but going back to demand, there is demand for clean drinking water. And the Ganges...
What's the answer to this?
No, I'm getting to it.
Okay.
The Ganges is 3,000 times the level of pollution that WHO deems safe, according to one number. And maybe you can argue about the numbers, but it's deeply dirty.
Yes, I agree.
And so as a society, I think we have to say what's important. Is buying stuff, or do we create a different system in which we put resources as a society and environment in solidarity? So perhaps part of the answer to France's employment problem might be people planting more trees or doing work that is a bit reminiscent of FDR's program.
CCC.
Yes. So we've got to somehow figure out both the resource allocation problem and the temporal problem, because we are fixated with quarterly results in this dominant economic paradigm, and the challenges we have are rather long term. As we know, eating sugar may give you a high, and maybe eating Coca-Cola and eating McDonald's and drinking Coca-Cola may give you an immediate high, but it will also give you a heart attack and diabetes. So perhaps it may not be fun for societies to be frugal and to, let's say, eat a salad, but to refocus on the long run, to go a little bit Gandhian or Buddhist may not be such a bad idea.
I agree with that. Are there questions from the floor, comments, disagreements?
I always have a fairly large mouth.
Excuse me?
I always have a fairly large mouth in these kind of things, but one thing that's interested me, there's been a lot of discussion about the word democracy. And I think it would be interesting, we don't have the time to do it, but it would be interesting if another game were played, and the game where each of you write down a definition of democracy. And then we would read it back and see what it says. Another word that comes out an awful lot is populism. It'd be very interesting for each of you to write down a definition of populism. My guess would be that your definitions of democracy would differ. And my guess would be that your different definitions of populism would both be incredibly different and probably wrong. And so, from my perspective. And so, my point is that before you can seriously discuss the kinds of issues that you seek to discuss today, we need to get to a point where when we use words, those words mean the same thing. No one used the word community conscience today, for example. That would be my formulation for what I think John was talking about earlier, the solidarity notion, the notion that if your neighbor is doing poorly, you are partially doing
Well, I
poorly.
think Atul was really
Well,
preaching that.
But my point is that no one used that phrase until I used it just now. And until we can get a vocabulary that is a common vocabulary, it's very difficult for four disparate people to discuss the kinds of amorphous topics we're talking about tonight and come together at any meaningful point. The big thing I learned today, and then I'll shut up, big thing I learned today was from Ian. It had never occurred to me, it had always occurred to me that Obama blew it, and that those of us on the left blew it badly when we didn't force Obama to not blow it. But it never occurred to me that 2007 and 2008 was a cataclysmic opportunity to have not blown it. So how could we all have fucked it up so badly? And then all of a sudden this clown Trump comes along, and Debbie would have us believe that all of a sudden the left is all over this, and we're going to sweep away the right in the upcoming elections, and all will be wonderful. Well, it ain't going to be wonderful. I don't think that's going to happen. It may. I hope it does, but I don't think it's going to happen. But I know it's not going to happen until we start talking to each other in a common vocabulary. And we are not doing that.
So first of all, I did not make a prediction about the next election.
I know you did. I know you did.
But I will point out that part of the resistance movement is cultivating a very broad cast of people to run in local elections and state elections and federal elections who haven't been running before. And that may in fact make a significant difference. It's one piece of the thing. So it'll be interesting to see if that works. I don't know. I do not have a prediction, and part of the reason I don't have a prediction is because I think that what is working now in Congress, which is, I would call a firewall of sorts against Trump's worst things, to the extent that that firewall holds, people have less reason to vote for someone else in the next election. So I'm not making a prediction there. But I will say to you that what held us back from cataclysmic change in 2007 and 2008 was the Republicans playing the role that we are now playing on the progressive side to prevent some of the worst policies from getting enacted. So it is the pros and the cons of our balance of power.
We sat it out. We sat it out for 6 years, and we kept waiting for Obama to lead the way, to open this door to change. And had we been, had the left, people like me, been as active in 2008 and 9 as we are now and seek to be now, maybe Ian's discussion would be entirely different about that 2007, 2008 period. And my fear is that unless we can get a common message, we're going to have exactly the same failure this time around. Look at the Democrats right now. My God, if they trot Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer out there on one more lawn one more time to give us some amorphous Big Bang theory, I'll want to puke again. It's awful. We're going to blow it again.
Any other responses to that?
I think he's right. I mean, you can't have a discredited democratic leadership after leading,
Oh, I agree with that.
into a cataclysmic failure.
About the need for common definitions and.
I think we have to strive to it, although having said that, the human condition is such that words have connotations and words have different meanings in different contexts, so it's hard to arrive at. But as a political messaging, yes, and as for ideas, you do need terminology. I mean, everyone hates Marx in America, or most people hate Marx, and it's, he's seen as an evil Satan-like figure. But Marx had some very interesting ideas which are relevant today, particularly in his diagnosis of the flaws of capitalism. For instance, the internal contradiction of capitalism. The fact that as a capitalist, the less workers you hire, the more you can fire, the more profits you have. So it will eventually lead to oversupply and a demand problem. And so he had some ideas. His solutions were a little based in romantic German thought and nostalgia for the tribal roots of his land, and have to be taken with more than a pinch of salt, actually whole buckets of salt. But the language he formulated did mobilize the masses, or at least did mobilize the intellectuals who mobilized the masses, and remained powerful for a century until 1991.
Yes, and he didn't go on about climate change and feminist agenda and all those things. He focused on the main issue, which was economic insecurity and fairness. I think, Bernie Sanders, as somebody said, was the only one who was talking about that in the last election cycle. And if we get those voices stronger, talking about the main issue, all these other things are very important, but they're not the main issue, and that's what we should speak on.
John?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I mean, I don't know.
Go ahead.
I was just going to point out the relevance of the Sanders campaign. While the Democrats are in disarray, mild disarray, and they say, oh my goodness, how do we get the independents? The reality is, during the primary, 42% of the people were identifying themselves as independent, and 1/3 of them were supporting Sanders. So, and the numbers were much lower for Hillary. I'm not trying to go back and discuss it. And I think absolutely central to his message was the emphasis on economic insecurity, and he would open up with, I forgot, but basically within the first 2 or 3 paragraphs of his stump speech, he would be talking about the distribution, which for like all candidates was, all across both parties, 25 candidates, it was a little crazy. This guy could actually talk about economic inequality. But he really actually was taking on a lot of those other issues. And I think after the election, too, he was the one who was standing up on Standing Rock. He was the one who was standing up on these issues. So in this country, I would also wonder when the Democrats are going to get a little more of a backbone. And I'm not talking about the resistance movement. I'm talking about the Democratic leadership that just seems to be flailing a little bit, not in terms of mobilizing an opposition, but in terms of defining what they truly are about today.
I think it's a legitimate question, but I also think it'll be really interesting to see what happens to the party if what you see is a big turnover in positions at the local level and the state level, and in particular if they take back a number of those Republican seats. And that could come out of the resistance. So I'm not saying that is the thing, but it'll be interesting to see how it interacts. I don't make a prediction about it.
John?
Just very quickly, I mean, the Democratic Party is not a monolith. I mean, they're clearly a faction that belongs to the Democratic Party of old, which focused on economic issues, had a strong union base, concerned about manufacturing questions, concerned about equity questions. And then there's the whole other section of the Democratic Party, which has been receiving so much money from Wall Street and from, moneyed interests in general, that it has shaped their perspective accordingly. So when we expect this kind of a party to come up with a unified message, the message it comes out with is what you were talking about, standing on the lawn and talking about, yet again, an attempt at the most abstract level to bring together these two wings of the party in a vaguely economic populist way, at least in terms of language, but not in terms of the actual reality of voting patterns. And it will lead either to a sufficient number of losses before the Democratic Party falls apart as a party, or the victory of one wing or the other, which will then lead the party in that direction.
2 hands up.
I had a question for Ian. You mentioned the role of corruption in the erosion of democracy. I was hoping to hear some more of your thoughts on that, especially since you've been posted in several corrupt states.
They wouldn't see it that way, of course. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's two sorts of corruptions. There's the corruption where people buy political influence, and I've certainly seen that in Nigeria and South Africa, where I've had quite a lot to do, particularly when I worked with Shell. And that was very fundamentally corrosive to the governance for those countries. And part of the reason those countries are in such dreadful states is that decisions are made not for the benefit of the people at large, but for the benefit of very small sectional interests that have the money. You could say that happens to a certain extent here in the United States, where both political parties regrettably take large amounts of money from very small numbers of people and are beholden to those policies. Curiously enough, the Iranians had a very uncorrupt system. It's
this kind of deviates from what other people I know who study Iran have said.
Oh, indeed. I mean, there are lots of other problems with the Iranian system, but it's not influenced by money. There are certainly different factions which try to influence the voting pattern. Somebody said to me the other day, they said, which countries of Europe would you like to live in? Would you like to live in Denmark, which is remarkable? And I have lived in Denmark. It's a very uncorrupt, very straight, rather Germanic, Teutonic society. Everybody knows exactly where they are, and it works very, very well. Or Italy, which, as we know, is horrendously corrupt and bureaucratic and all that sort of stuff. But actually, most people would prefer to live in Italy because it's just a much nicer place to live. So there's no easy answers to that. I think corruption is one of those things we have to live with. Not that I approve of it in any way, but we at least should see it with our eyes open for what it is. And as long as we have the vote, not be influenced by it.
Can I add just a couple? I have a piece on Fair Observer on this question specifically. I see, if we're looking at global movements against dictatorship, against concentration of wealth, the corruption issue is perhaps the leading edge. It may become the leading edge here in the United States as we focus on the wealth and the corruption of the Trump family. But if you're looking at protests in Russia, in Turkey, in Hungary, in Venezuela, in Brazil, throughout Latin America, it is corruption which is the leading edge because it brings together people who are upset about economic inequality, who are upset about lack of transparency, who are upset about a range of issues bringing together the middle class, unfairness. One last kind of quip in the article, I say, it's often said that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. And I would say that corruption is the socialism of the greedy. And I think if we look at what will be the kind of mobilizing effort against the greedy, it'll be these anti-corruption efforts.
And we saw this in the Arab Spring, of
Just
course.
I want to get one question here. Who's been very patient.
No, it's okay. I had more of a comment, so if you want
Go ahead.
It's going to kind of segue.
Because we're getting to 8, so I want to make sure we don't fail to give you your turn.
So just had a brief comment. Thank you. It's been excellent analysis throughout the evening. And really kind of going off of this point of corruption, I think one aspect of the discussion that's been left out, except for for the talk of solidarity and corruption as a manifestation in the political reality that we see. We see a corrupt politics. I think part of the discussion, what's been missing is that there's really a spiritual root to the problem, and this idea of the corruption of the soul. And I think there's really a fight for the soul of America, and part of the movement that we're seeing that hasn't really been discussed this evening is like the revival movement. There are a few reverends, and there's a great interfaith movement that's really coming together, making people realize, starting to awaken this notion of like a collective responsibility, that we're all here in service and as protectors to one another, and from all different faith backgrounds. And so I think there is hope, if there is hope in the democracy movement. My comment would be that perhaps it has to do with the faith movement and with this realization of a higher conscious that I'm accountable to beyond myself. This world is not about me. This world is about all of us. This world is about the future and about the love of our children and the world that our children are going to live in. And so I hope that, to kind of be the optimist, I hope that our panelists will, may consider that there is hope with, with the movement of conscience and ethics.
Well, I would very much hope that
myself.
that the
And I'm very, very sympathetic with your point. Anyway,
Yeah.
one last comment.
No, I was just going to say that I think there's a great deal of hope there that the faith-based community should embrace the roots that no rich man can enter the kingdom of heaven, and pay attention to the realities, the real virtues that are preached in all of the faith books. That the faith-based community should not be a prisoner of the right.
Well, I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank Atul, and I want to thank our host. And you want to sign off in your other hat, Atul?
No, thank you all for coming. Dinner is going to be a short walk away in the kitchen. Have a good evening. And those of you who are watching around the world, thank you for watching us. All the best to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.